In this episode, we'll talk about Jesus is Lord, and the Lord is Jehovah. Here we go. All right, so setting the stage from last week, you recall that Paul had come to Jerusalem. He had met with James the Just and the members of the Jerusalem church there. And then he ended up going to the temple, and he had a group of people that had gone with him, those that actually shaved their heads, that were committed to work with him. There's some funny business going on with this. He ends up going to the temple, and then there at the temple, there are some Jews from Asia, which would be parts in Turkey, that identify him and say that he is teaching against the law of Moses, against the people, and against the temple. And so he's then taken away because there's a riot that starts up. It almost seems like there is collusion going on here, that something happened between some people that were in this meeting with Paul and the Christians, and that they set this up. I don't know if that's true, but if you go back and read through it, it seems odd the way it's written. And it seems like somehow there may have been a setup here for Paul. Now remember that early on in Christianity here, everything is not hunky-dory with the Christians. There, of course, is great joy about learning about Christ and the resurrection from the dead, and the fullness of the gospel, and the second coming, and all of these things, the priesthood being given to many people, and the gospel going to the Gentiles. It's an incredible outpouring of the Spirit and of truth and of excitement and joy. But at the same time, this is not like the birth of a brand new baby, where you have a precious little baby that is completely innocent and no flaws, right? That's not how this works. This is the same thing that happened in the church early on. Think of all of the struggles that Joseph Smith and the leaders of the church had early on with the church. Of course, there was an outpouring of the Spirit. I mean, can you imagine the stories that came about to new converts into the church, and the whole thing with the Book of Mormon and the plates and the translation, and having a prophet again on the earth in Joseph Smith, and the fullness of the gospel and of the priesthood of John the Baptist coming, and Peter, James, and John, and building up the church again, the true church with the priesthood and the keys and the doctrine. I mean, what an incredible time and an outpouring of the Spirit that was happening. But at the same time, there are major conflicts and struggles that are happening here. This is the last thing in the world that the world wants, is this pureness of truth and righteousness. It's going to naturally have a very difficult time coming into fruition. And so this is what's happening at Paul's time. There are conflicts within the church. Think of the conflict that they had about circumcision. That's probably still going on here. That is still a major issue. These are mostly Jewish Christians. And the whole preaching to the Gentiles, which is Paul's major mission here, may be a real issue to several of the Christians. And it is interesting here that we don't see the Christians coming to Paul's defense. For whatever reason, Luke doesn't have the Christians coming here as witnesses to his defense. So the Romans have come in, they've bound Paul and taken him from the temple, and because he was causing a riot, apparently. And Paul turns to the captain of the guard here and says, "Please let me speak to the people. I want to speak to the people here so they can understand." Now think about the audience here. Who is the audience? The audience is likely Christians, some for him and some very possibly against him, and Jews, which would not be, again, Jews are not lockstep. There are different groups, and here we're going to see this focus on the Pharisees against the Sadducees, And then you have the Romans that are here and maybe many other people. This is during the festival. So there's a lot of people in here from all over the place. This would be Jews from all out in the diaspora, Jews from Jerusalem. Paul is a major figure. And there's a lot of conflict and there's a lot of controversy here with Paul. And so we open up chapter 22 with the following, with the speech that Paul gives to this audience. He says, "Men, brethren, and fathers, hear ye my defense, which I make now unto you." And then down in verse 3, "I am verily a man which am a Jew, born in Tarsus, a city in Cilicia, yet brought up in this city," this is Jerusalem, "at the feet of Gamaliel, and taught according to the perfect manner of the law of the fathers, and was zealous toward God, as ye all are this day." He's saying, look, I'm one of you. I come from the same background, especially of these very zealous Jews that have a real problem with him. He's saying, I'm one of you. I come from the same background. I've been taught this way since a little kid. He was taught from sitting at the feet of Gamaliel. Now, Gamaliel is a little bit different, right? For whatever reason, Gamaliel is someone who was a moderate, and he was one that did not try to fight against the Romans. He did not try to fight against the Christians. He was kind of a live and let live kind of a guy, a moderate. And that was a big part of the school, one school of thought with the Jews. Another school of thought was those who were a lot more zealous toward the Romans especially, and the Christians. It was, this is the law, this is how things have to be, and we may end up having to pick up swords against the Christians and swords against the Romans, and we need to make our liberation here just like they did in Egypt, right, with the Exodus. We need a Moses figure. We need a Messiah, not Jesus to them. We need a Messiah to lead us. And maybe the prophecies of Daniel and others are telling us that about now, this is what they would have been thinking, about now there would be a political Messiah that would free them from the shackles of the Roman Empire. But of course, that's not what happens. The Messiah comes all right, but not the Messiah that they have in mind. So Paul was one of these that was zealous against the Romans and against the Christians, against his mentor, right? He went to the other school of thought, which would have likely been similar to the thought of many of those that are in his audience right now. And then in verse 4, "And I persecuted this way unto the death, binding and delivering into prisons both men and women." He says, and I persecuted this way. So you might say that is a reference to the zealousness that he had and that school of thought that he had. But remember, the way is also an early name for the Christians. And so he's saying, look, I was one of you fighting against the Christians, and now here I am a Christian. And why the way? Well, a lot of reasons why this could be. But again, think about the procession of Jesus coming into Jerusalem. To me, that may be an anchor point for the reason that they call Christianity the way, or this way. He was on that path of that procession, he being the king, the Messiah, Jehovah, that would be coming into the temple in the way. It's just like John used to preach, prepare ye the way. Well, what is the way? The way is the way of the king, right? So it would be, it's a sci-fi novel too, but it's the way of the king. So it's, in other words, it's the true Messiah, being Jehovah, coming in from the east into Jerusalem and going out up into the temple, just as happened on Palm Sunday. So he says here that he persecuted this way unto the death, binding and delivering into prisons both men and women. So that's what he did. Again, a lot like Alma the Younger would have been. Same type of an attitude. He tried to destroy Christianity. And then he gives a retelling of what happened to him on the road to Damascus. And this is the second time Luke brings this up. Remember, we've already talked about this once, what actually happened to Paul on the road to Damascus. Now he's recounting this. And he's recounting it. And he'll recount it again in the next episode. We'll cover it yet again. But this is the same thing that happens with Alma the Younger. Alma the Younger is, we hear about what happens to him as he is out persecuting the church. And the angel of the Lord comes and they fall to the ground, and then he stands up and talks to him, and he's out of it for 3 days because he's so freaking scared is what it is. And then later on, he's speaking to his son in Alma 36, and he gives a recounting of what happened yet again. And they're very, very similar types of things, very similar experiences. There's something I really want to point out here that's important. He says, "And it came to pass that as I made my journey and was come nigh unto Damascus, about noon, suddenly there shone from heaven a great light round about me. And I fell unto the ground and heard a voice saying unto me, Saul, Saul, why persecutest thou me? And I answered, Who art thou, Lord? And he said unto me, I am Jesus of Nazareth, whom thou persecutest." Now, I made a point before where Saul was, in the episode where Saul had seen the Lord here, about the Lord being Jehovah. In other words, what we see oftentimes in the New Testament, when we see the term Lord, what they are using that word for is Jehovah. So let's move back a little bit. We can move backward to find out kind of this etymology or this DNA going back to Jehovah. When they wrote the Septuagint, which we went over an episode or two ago, they used the Greek word kurios. And kurios means Lord. There's another form of that word, which is Kyrie. And Kyrie is what is the word that is used whenever you address someone in a respectful manner, or it's someone who's above you in a class. So it could be saying, for example, sir or Mr. even. And so it's interesting here what we see in verses 8 through 10. And bear with me in a minute, and I'm going to get to the reason I'm talking about this. It says, and I, again in 8, and I answered, Who art thou, Lord? And he said unto me, I am Jesus of Nazareth, whom thou persecutest. Again, what we see here, I believe, is Luke trying to bring together what the Jews don't understand. And that is that Jesus is Jehovah. It's not that he's the Messiah. That's part of it. Again, completely different ideas between the Jews and the Christians of what the Messiah represents. So Luke is bringing this together, and of course Paul is bringing this together here, saying that Jesus is Jehovah. And so when you read throughout the New Testament, oftentimes you'll see the term Jesus is Lord. What they're actually saying there, I think, is Jesus is Jehovah. Well, that's of course our doctrine. We believe that. Jesus or Jehovah is the God of the Old Testament. And so when we're dealing with the term God, in most cases, maybe not all, maybe not El Elyon, which is the God Most High, but we're typically, when we're referring to God, we're referring to Jehovah, who is Jesus. And so then in verse 10, he says, And I said, What shall I do, Lord? And the Lord said unto me, Arise and go into Damascus, and there it shall be told thee of all things which are appointed for thee to do. Now, 2 times we see the word Lord here. First in verse 10, the first time in verse 10 it says, And I said, What shall I do, Lord? So this is Kyrie. This is where you use that term when you are addressing someone of a higher class. It would still be Lord, right? It would be Lord. Think of old English times, right? Where you might, in someone who has property or is a higher class, and you're a lower class person, you might say to someone, Lord. Similar type of a thing, except that is the term that anciently was used here in Greek for Jehovah as well. So if you were praying to God, you would use the Greek Kyrie when you're addressing him. But when you are referring to him, as Lord, as Adonai, which is what they used in Hebrew, you would use Kyrios. And in the second example here, it says, and the Lord, so he's not addressing him, and the Lord said unto me, it's Kyrios. So again, I'm just trying to put a little something here together, a little puzzle here together for you that says Luke is trying to give you a specific narrative. Paul is trying to give you a specific narrative, it appears to me, which is Jesus is Jehovah. He's not just the Messiah that you're looking for. He's God. He is your God. So very big difference here. And then he gives the account of when probably a few years later, he is in Jerusalem again, and he's in the temple, and he has a vision here in a trance. And in this vision, he sees God again. He sees the Lord. He sees Jesus Christ, who tells him, again, go out and teach the Gentiles. That is his mission. And so he's defending himself to a lot of these Jews that are like, look, what are you doing? You're trying to bring people into the fold that shouldn't be in the fold, right? None of these people are circumcised. You're teaching them from our scriptures, and they're not Jews. So he's defending himself. So then at this point, the chief captain is going to bring him into the castle and is going to whip him and try and get the truth out of him about him causing this riot. And then Paul brings up the fact that he is a Roman citizen. And at first, the captain is incredulous, but then he's afraid because he realizes he has to follow certain rules and that he could be in a lot of trouble if he doesn't follow these rules with a Roman citizen. And so he loosens Paul from his bands and commands him to present himself before the high priests and the council. And then we go over to chapter 23. And then over in verse 23, we get a theme here, which is very interesting. It's, again, very similar to one of my favorite stories and characters, and I think is hugely central to all of our scriptures, and that's Abinadi. Paul defends himself by saying that he is a follower of God, just like he should be, that he is not doing anything wrong. He's following the law of Moses. He is following the teachings of the prophets and of the Torah and the scriptures. And he opens up chapter 23 saying, men and brethren, I have lived in all good conscience before God until this day. In other words, hey, I'm clean. I follow the rules that I'm supposed to follow. And the high priest Ananias commands that he's going to be smitten, right? And Paul says, thou whited wall. In other words, you hypocrite. For sittest thou to judge me after the law, and commandest me to be smitten contrary to the law? So, in other words, you're charging me with breaking the law, which I don't, and yet you're going to lay a consequence down here, which is contrary to the law. But another thing that is contrary to the law is speaking ill of the high priest. Very similar to saying, do we sustain the brethren, right? So he doesn't know even that Ananias is the high priest, which is very odd. Not that he doesn't know specifically, but what attire would an Ananias be in? I don't know. It seems like he should be in something, a certain type, maybe not the temple garb at this point. But he doesn't know that he's the high priest. And that would be common, right? Because there could be overturn of the different high priests, and there are numerous high priests. There are 3 major high priests, just like we have in the first presidency. And he just didn't know. He hasn't been in Jerusalem. But then, at this point, Paul gets wise, and he notices that the audience here of Jews are divided between Pharisees and Sadducees. And so he's going to bring up the topic of resurrection, because that is a bitter issue between these two sects of Jews. The Sadducees not believing in resurrection, the Pharisees believing in resurrection. And so this is what he does. I am a Pharisee, the son of a Pharisee, of the hope and resurrection of the dead, I am called in question. In other words, one of the things he's talking about is the resurrection of Jesus Christ. So by saying that he is Jehovah and God and that he has resurrected, he is taking more of a stance over toward the Pharisees who believe in the resurrection. And so he works that in with the doctrine of resurrection to align himself here with the Pharisees, of which he is one. but completely against the Sadducees. And this is such a bitter issue between these two groups that they start forgetting about Paul himself because they both want to defend their doctrine and their positions here. And it says here in verse 9, and the scribes that were of the Pharisees' part arose and strove, saying, we find no evil in this man. Again, they're protecting their own doctrine. But if a spirit or an angel hath spoken to him, let us not fight against God. Isn't that convenient for them? Hey, he says he spoke to someone, that someone told him what we believe too, so, who are we to say? Makes a lot of sense. Truth is a funny thing, isn't it? And so there arises a great dissension, and the captain, fearing lest Paul should have been pulled in pieces of them, commanded the soldiers to go down and take him by force from among them and to bring him into the castle. And then we get another visit here from the Lord. In verse 11, and the night following, the Lord stood by him and said, be of good cheer, Paul, for as thou hast testified of me in Jerusalem, so must thou bear witness also at Rome. Well, this is Paul's goal. This is what he wants. He wants to go to the heart of the beast, and he will. And so then there is conspiracy and oaths that are taken by 40 Jews that are going to lay in waiting to try and trap Paul and kill him. But it comes out, his nephew and his sister help him out. And then the chief captain decides, okay, this is just too dangerous. This is a Roman citizen, and I have to protect him or I'm going to be in trouble. So they get ready some beasts and a traveling crew, how many? Over 200 soldiers, to bring him from Jerusalem to Caesarea, where he'll have more protection there. And that takes us to chapter 24. And so in Caesarea, the high priest Ananias descends with the elders and confronts Paul with a lawyer who is a Roman. This is Tertullus, who comes with him. Now, it might be that he was required to be there, that in Caesarea, they might have required that there was a Roman lawyer that would represent them. I'm not sure. Or it might have just been the plan of the high priest to have a Roman represent them in front of the Roman governor Felix here. And Tertullus is arguing for sedition, and that he says, the sect of the Nazarenes, which would be, hey, this is the Jews, but this is a certain sect that he's calling the Nazarenes. Again, I've said this before, I'm not really sure that Nazarenes is the right translation for this group, but we'll go with it for now. And so here's the charge: sedition and profanity in the temple against Paul. So Paul steps up to defend himself, and this is what he says, which is really interesting and very important for us to understand about the difference between the Christians of the time, the sect of the Nazarenes, and the Jews, or the rest of the Jews, or the majority of the Jews at this time. So down in verse 10 it says, then Paul, after that the governor had beckoned unto him to speak, answered, for as much as I know that thou hast been of many years a judge unto this nation, I do the more cheerfully answer for myself. So again, he has no representation. Where is everybody? Where is James the Just? Where are the leaders of the church in Jerusalem? Did they not come to Caesarea also? It's kind of odd. So he begins to defend himself here, and he says in verse 12, and they neither found me in the temple disputing with any man. He was just teaching and preaching, neither raising up the people, neither in the synagogues nor in the city. So he's saying, look, this is rubbish. None of this stuff is true that they're saying against me. Then in 14 comes the nugget that we're looking for. This is really important. He says, but this I confess unto thee, that after the way which they call heresy, so worship I the God of my fathers. So let's break this down a little bit, parse this out, and see what we're getting here. I confess unto thee that after the way which they call heresy. So they're talking about not just that he profaned the temple, but about the doctrines that he's bringing up. It's a court of doctrinal disputation here is really what's happening. That's what Luke is showing us here. It is the difference between the lower law that the Jews had continued to accept and actually are not following, just like the priests of Noah, and the higher law with the fulfillment of the priesthood and of the true Messiah. And so he's saying, look, I do follow these things that they say are heresy. I worship God in this manner. In other words, I worship Jesus Christ as Jehovah, as the Son of God, and that I worship him as the God of my fathers. Well, who are their fathers, the Jews that are there? It's the same fathers, of course. And he ties it together saying, believing all things which are written in the law, that's the Torah, and in the prophets, that's the rest of the Tanakh. So he's saying, look, I'm not doing anything wrong based on their law at all. And everything that I believe and that I worship that they call heresy is all in the Tanakh. It's all in the Septuagint. It's all in the scriptures. But they're not following it. In other words, Jesus Christ is the Son of God. And this doctrine that I preach about the resurrection and about the Son of God, Jehovah, coming down and being born into mortality, taking on the sins of the world, dying on the cross, and then being resurrected, this is all in the scriptures. Just like we're told over and over again from Apollos and everybody else, all of the prophets have always taught this. But all of the prophets have been stoned or killed. Maybe not all of them, but a lot of them. This is what they do. It is the Nehor principle, and it is a consequence of the Nehor principle. So we have the same scriptures, but we don't believe the same thing about them. You interpret this as something completely different. I interpret this as it should be, which is the suffering servant, Malachi, Zechariah, all of the prophets, Moses, have prophesied of Jesus Christ and have prophesied of the suffering servant, the individual that Jehovah would come down and suffer for us. And that's all in the Old Testament. And so Felix decides to not do anything to Paul at this time, but that he's going to hold him, but gives him some liberty here in Caesarea. And finally, after a few days, he has Paul come unto him and to his wife, who is a Jewess. And Paul says to them, talks to them about his faith in Christ. And then, again, he reasons of the righteousness, temperance, and judgment to come. And Felix trembled and answered, Go thy way for this time. When I have a convenient season, I will call for thee. And Paul is here for 2 years. And Felix, even though he is afraid about this judgment, about what Paul is saying about Christ, he wants to please the Jews also. And so he leaves him bound. And that's where this episode ends. And so Paul, fiercely defending himself, is fiercely defending the prophets of the Old Testament and the message that they had to offer, which was Jesus is the Christ, or in other words, Jehovah will come down to earth and be born of a woman and bear the sins of the world. And that's what we need to be looking forward to. His message is that the scriptures all testify of Jesus Christ. His message in this court is that Jesus took on the sins of the world. And his message is that he was resurrected on the third day and overcame all. I'll talk to you next time.